Hello. In this talk, I'm going to discuss the question of whether computers can be considered artists, including so-called AI. To do so, I'll describe many other times in history when technology changed the way that we make art and the way that we understand art. And I think that looking at this history will provide a lot of useful lessons for the challenges that we face today. I'm going to explain why I believe that art is really a social behavior, one that we do for and with other humans. This talk originally began as a paper that I published way back in 2018, and a lot has changed since then, but a lot of the lessons of history remain the same. Before I begin, a bit about myself. I studied art and computing in college, and over the past 30 years, I've done research in computer graphics algorithms inspired by art. I also still like to spend lots of time drawing. My art experiences have informed a lot of my research over the years. So, for example, here's an installation that we made as part of my PhD thesis. It's a canvas that continually paints a picture of you as you move around in front of it. And we showed it at some art exhibitions in New York in 2001. So the past decade or so has really felt like a whirlwind of activity and attention for AI-based art. I date this really, I did this to 2015 with the introduction of Deep Dream, which is a kind of fun and interesting technique for a while. Neural style transfer was presented in 2015 as well, and this was a fun toy a lot of people like to play with. And both of these methods were shown in our exhibitions, such as this one that was shown in San Francisco in 2016. Another notable moment was the auction of an GAN-generated artwork for €500,000, and this was even signed with the GAN loss function. Now, academic researchers have gotten involved in making statements about AI artwork. Here's a technique from a paper called Creative Adversarial Networks, and it has a very interesting approach in this paper to defining new visual styles. But the thing I want to focus on is in the abstract, where they say, we propose a new system for generating art. This system generates art by looking at art and learning about style and becomes creative. So the authors are making very strong statements about the role of the computer in this system. And this was picked up by the news media. Headlines say artificially intelligent painters invent new styles of art. The AI artist that can create its own painting style, and critics even prefer some of its work to human efforts. And again, this is back in 2017. Here's a video of one of the preeminent art critics in the world, Jerry Saltz, talking about that algorithm. And the thing to notice here is the level of agency that he gives to this piece of computer code.
Initial thoughts, incredibly dull, generic, boring. The programmers are not freeing up the program. I want the robot to tap into its inner robot. Be free.
So it's a simple GAN model, but he's essentially presented it as though it's an independent artistic entity. More recently in 2022, DALL-E was developed and made available to the public, and you could just type in a bit of text and images would be generated, and suddenly this created a lot of excitement, energy, and anger and controversy. And this is kind of the world we live in now. So in this talk, I want to focus on the question of whether computers can create art, whether we can think of computers as artists. And often people treat this as just a matter of technological capability, that if the pictures are good enough that come out of the machine, then that makes the machine an artist. On the other hand, other people I've talked to sort of treat it as, of course, computers can't be artists. Art requires intent or expression, and there's sort of a sense of art is fundamentally a human activity, like having a soul. And I agree with a lot of these intuitions, but they're not very scientific. It'd be nice to make them a little more concrete, like what do they actually mean, or what are they saying? And the main points I'm going to say here is that people make art sometimes using computers, and so all of the art that we make with computers is human-made art. And this is in part because art is a social behavior. It's a thing that we do with and for other people. However, new technologies transform art, the way we make art, the way we appreciate it. And history provides many useful lessons for what happens when these technologies come along, and the way people respond to new artistic technologies. Now, these are very, in some cases, controversial topics. There are a lot of concerns and strong emotions here, often for very good reasons. There's lots of legitimate concerns around copyright. But I'm not going to discuss that here so much. I'm not making policy recommendations. I'm really here recommending ways to talk about art and technology that avoid a lot of the pitfalls. There's a lot of ways to have a gut response to these new technologies that's really quite misleading. And I think it's worthwhile being a lot more careful about how we think of the role of each of these new technologies. So, as one of my main themes here is that technology has transformed art many times throughout history. One early example is the development of oil paint. Oil paint, as compared to the earlier technology of fresco, has much greater tonal range and can depict basically more colors. It's also much more easier and practical than fresco. In response, Michelangelo, who is more of a master of the older fresco style, said the new stuff is for amateurs. Within the Western tradition, over the following centuries, artists got better and better at using oil paint to create highly realistic and dazzling depictions of reality. And I think it's really hard for us right now to appreciate how special it would have been to see pictures like this. We today are surrounded by photographs and realistic imagery online and print and on our cameras. And it's hard for us to appreciate just how special it would have been to see what could only have been done by a painter 200 years ago. So the role of the painter was and the identity of the artist was very highly tied up in their ability to create these kinds of pictures, which only they could make. Now, at the same time, photography was initially invented in the early 1820s. This is the first known existing photograph. And there was initially technology tinkerers playing around with chemistry and optics. Here's the first Instagram instance of meal. Here's a picture that Daguerre took out his window. And because these are long exposures of around 10 minutes, most people walking by would be blurred out. But you can see there's a fellow getting his shoe shine in the lower left there. And so this is the first known photograph of a person. Here's the first selfie. But this technique really became widely available when Daguerre publicly described his invention. The French government bought him out so that he wouldn't patent it because they believed that this technology was widely useful. And immediately, with these first demonstrations of the technique, traditional artists said, in the words of the great Turner, "This is the end of art. I am glad I have had my day." Because here is a machine that does what artists do. It makes realistic pictures. So what actually happened? Well, one of the roles of painting was portraiture. As today, we like to have pictures of ourselves, of our family and friends and ancestors. In 1838, if you were very, very wealthy, you could hire a painter to paint a picture of you. If you're not so wealthy, you might have a silhouette picture made, so it's not a great likeness. So once photography came around, people in portrait studios, photography studios emerged where people could get their portraits made through photography. And even though you had to sit with your head in a brace and sit very still for 10 or 30 minutes, it became very, very popular. And so as a result, we have all these wonderful photos by people like the colorful photographer Nadar, of figures from the 19th century, such as this picture of the photographer Matthew Brady. Within several decades, painters, at least one painter said, photography has harmed painting considerably and has killed portraiture, especially once the livelihood of the artist. And this is because portrait painters were unable to find work in the way they had been before because photography was faster and cheaper. And so painters either had to switch to photography or were unable to find work as portraiturists. On the higher end, as it were, there was a discussion of whether photography is art. And on one hand, there were the tinkerers, the people exploring with the technology and making pictures and seeing what happened. One thing that often happens with a new technology is that people try to mimic the existing artistic styles, both to develop the technology artistically and also to justify it. So with photography, that movement was called pictorialism. And here's a classical style tableau created through a multiple exposure composite with pictorialism that had the same kind of horizontal tableau as a lot of classical painting. And it took many, many decades before photography emerged into its own It had eventually its own style, its own language, and was, by the beginning of the 20th century, accepted by major museums and galleries as a separate art form. Now, throughout this, there were, of course, the haters, people like the poet Charles Baudelaire, who said, if photography is allowed to stand in for art, it will corrupt it completely, thanks to the stupidity of the multitude. So this technology is going to replace art and make it stupid, because people are stupid. Ultimately, painters began to see this as a challenge. Whistler wrote, the imitators are poor kind of creatures, for the artists to do something beyond this. And so he made these atmospheric, gauzy paintings that were quite different from what photography was capable of at the time. But Van Gogh, in his pivotal year of 1888, wrote to his brother that accurate drawing is not the thing to aim at, because a reflection of reality would not be a picture at all, no more than a photograph. So now this is a 180. He is saying that actually making realistic pictures is not what artists do, because that's just photography. And this whole story ushers in the modern art movement of the early 20th century, where making realistic pictures is no longer viewed as one of the major goals of painting. An important step in the development of modern art is the notion of conceptual art, especially this famous work by Duchamp, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a urinal that Duchamp turned upside down, signed, called it a fountain, and submitted to an art show. And this is considered one of the most famous and influential works of 20th century art. So in summary, it looked like photography automated art because it does what artists do. It makes realistic pictures, and many artists feared it and condemned it for those reasons. What actually happened is it created a new art form, photography, which is considered distinct from painting. It invigorated the old art form of painting. I would argue that modern art emerged in part because of photography. Many jobs were affected. Many portraiturists were replaced with photo studios, and so they had to retrain or find other work, or lost their work. And I haven't mentioned this already, image creation was made much more easily available to hobbyists. Nowadays, we're all carrying phones around in our pockets with cameras attached to them. And so it's very easy for all of us to make pictures all the time in ways that we couldn't have done it 200 years ago. There are many trends here. They're very complicated. And I argue that in some form, many of these trends repeat with each new art technology to varying degrees. But there are many common features that many different technologies share when they change art. Now, some people have responded to that previous slide by saying, I'm making it sound like there's nothing to worry about with the new changes. And we could ask, are the new changes different? And of course, every new technology is different. There's a lot now that people didn't have to worry about 200 years ago. My only point here is that what's different is not the things people usually think they are. And I think that studying these trends of history is a way to avoid the naive gut reactions and avoid cognitive biases. So, for example, people have initially complained that the new AI tools can't be art because it's just pressing a button. But if that's true, then photography is not art as well, because photography is also just pressing a button. And so whatever concerns we have about the new technology is they have to be a little bit more thoughtful than that. If you can apply that same concern to photography or other things I'll talk about, then that may be a problem for that criticism. Now, as part of this discussion, I may need to tell you a little bit about what is art, or what is the kind of art that I'm talking about here. So I use the term art very broadly. I talk about visual art, photography, conceptual art, and I would say children's drawing and amateur drawing is also art. Movies, music, video games, theater, and many other things. I take a very broad notion of what art is, and I don't see the value in slicing it up more finely than that. Even though most of my examples in this talk are primarily visual art. Some people have, when I present this talk, they infer what I'm claiming with definition of art is, or they ask me what my definition of art is. And the thing is that there is no single definition of art. I think it's not really possible to come up with a short, simple definition of art. And if you want to know more about that, I recommend the book The Art Question by Nigel Warburton. A lot of people's intuitions about what the definition of art is don't really generalize well, or don't really follow through if you think through the implications. But I still think it's useful and worthwhile to talk about art without trying to come up with a definition of art. So now let's come back to conceptual art. Sol LeWitt is another important figure in conceptual art, and these are examples of paintings that he made. In these cases, he didn't actually make them by hand himself, though. He wrote down sets of instructions, and then other people can actually execute on the paintings. And in his writings about conceptual art, his theses, he argued that it's really the idea behind the work, the definition of where the paintings, how the paintings are made, that is the real work of the artist here. He wrote, "The idea is a machine that makes the art." And so this very naturally leads into early computer art. And so in the 1960s, as soon as people could make pictures with computers, they started making art with it. And these are three examples of generative art where people wrote code that made artworks. The one on the left is in a picture in this style of a particular Mondrian painting. And throughout the 20th century since then, there's an enormous, amazing variety of computer-based art of all different kinds, which I clearly don't have time to summarize in this talk because it's a vast history. I'll just mention three of my favorites: the evolutionarily generated screensavers of Scott Draves, in which these things sort of autonomously are evolve over time in response to people's upvotes or downvotes. Jason Salavan's visualizations, including this picture, which is an average of many different wedding photos over time, and Sophia Crespo's interesting CAN-generated artificial botany. One of the most important AI artists of the 20th century is Harold Cohen. He began as a contemporary fine artist who is from one of the major art schools, Slade School of Art in London, and he started out writing rules for himself to follow when painting by hand on paper, and then he would just simply follow those rules and see what happened. In the early 1970s, he discovered computer programming at Fortran, and then from that point on, he started writing those rules in code rather than by hand. And he spent the rest of his artistic career, programming algorithms that made paintings, and these are paintings that are collected by major galleries and institutions. There was a recent retrospective of his work in the Whitney a few years ago. In the more popular end of computer animation, Alvy Ray Smith tell the story about how before he co-founded Pixar with Ed Catmull, they would go down to Disney and try to convince them to adopt computer animation tools. And they said that back then the animators were afraid of the computer. They thought it was going to take their jobs away, and they spent a lot of time telling them that the computer is just a tool, it doesn't do the creativity. Indeed, if you've ever worked with computer animation tools, you know how incredibly labor-intensive they are, but how much talent and skill and artistic ability they require. Computer animation is very much an artistic performance in the way that previous hand-drawn animation had been. And this is why Pixar's early days were really driven by the mantra, art challenges technology, technology inspires art. And nowadays, if you watch the credits of any animated movie, you see an enormous number of artists were employed in order to create the animation. But this is also true for so many of our so-called live action and VFX films that involve so much computer animation in many parts of the process. And there's an entertaining series of videos online about how no CGI is just hidden CGI, which I recommend watching if you're interested in that. In my own work, I began my studies with my first paper, which is the technique for taking a photograph and making a painting from it. This was published in SIGGRAPH 98. And this original paper was based on just a series of kind of rules and instructions that I wrote that use the material as source image to decide where to place brushstrokes. And anyone can read the paper and understand the reasoning and decision-making process involved in this algorithm. And this is the source of the interactive installation that I showed earlier. Now, through this process, I found it difficult to define different rules for making paintings, and so I came up with the idea of doing it from examples. And this is a paper called Image Analogies that we published with my co-authors in 2001. And in this example, it's using elements of the texture in the picture in the top and applying them to the photo on the left. And even though it's learning from examples, you can read the paper and understand how the decision-making process works and how the pastel illustration is being made here. Now, I've summarized this long history of computer-generated art, and throughout this whole history, people are saying, the headlines, the discussion is, the robot can paint, but is it art? Go back, 40 years to computer art, is it really art? So, for the past 60 years, people have been making art with computers, and they keep asking the same questions over and over again. Each time someone sees, oh, the computer made a picture, is the computer an artist? And the answer has always been the same for 60 years. The computer is a tool for people to make art. All computer art is really human-made art. Now, in many of my discussions over the years, it seems like I've seen a lot of people have the assumption or explicit statement that being an artist is a matter of making good pictures. If you can make good pictures, it makes you an artist, and it's the same for a machine. And I think this is a thought process a lot of people go through in various ways. And I want to look at how Harold Cohen went through that process.
10 years after that, I would have said, look, the program is doing this on its own. Another 10 years on, and I would have said, the fact that the program is doing this on its own is the central issue here. It was producing complex images of a high quality, and I could have had it go on forever without rewriting a single line of code. How much more autonomous than that can one get?
So he's saying, I have a computer algorithm that makes pictures. They're being sold, they're being framed and displayed in major art galleries and museums. Doesn't that make it an artist?
Well, of course, that's exactly the point. It's virtually impossible to imagine a human being in a similar position. The human artist is modified in the act of making art. For the program to have been similarly self-modifying would have required not merely that it be capable of assessing its own output, but that it had its own modifiable worldview to provide a basis for any meaningful assessment.
So it's a thought process a lot of us have gone through. I made a computer algorithm that generates images. Maybe that makes it an artist. And then you keep using it over and over again. You're like, well, it actually feels like it's missing something. Harold Cohen thought it was missing a modifiable worldview. And other people have made other statements for what computers would have to make them autonomous artists. But yet, whatever statement you make, there is some existing code or algorithm that actually does that. So, for example, people often define creativity in terms of making things that are aesthetically valuable and surprising and novel, perhaps unpredictable. Here's a video of the Mandelbrot set, which was developed in the 1980s, and you can watch it for a very long time. It's visually dazzling and really fun to watch, and it can be this is a 10 or 20 minute video, and it just never gets boring. It's really quite, by that definition of creativity, it's quite creative. And yet, it's 10 lines of code, and chaos theory tells us it is unpredictable. And yet, if those were enough definitions to make an artist, then this would be an artist. Same for the code that I wrote as part of my thesis. Again, it's unpredictable. You can't tell exactly what it's going to do. And so, by a lot of definitions of being an artist, it's an artist. And so when people say if AI makes good pictures, that makes it an artist, then I would say, well, we have over 150 years of history of machines that can make art by that definition. We have photography and our smartphone cameras and all this generative arts and all of the artwork that Harold Cohen's machines made that was shown in galleries. And if it were the case that that was enough to make an artist, then we would already be calling these things artists. Yet, instead, it's the case that computers are yet another technology that people use to make art, even when the code is running, quote, autonomously. And so, in short, everything that we call computer-generated art is really human-made art. It's humans making computers, making art with computers. And so people say, okay, well, what about text image? Surely that makes it an artist. And I say it's the same thing. You type in text, you produce pictures, and these things, on some level, these makes more skilled drawings better than I would, certainly faster. And people ask the same question, whether it's art, and I say, of course, it's still art. It's art made by a person using an algorithm, in this case, text to image. It's the question we should really be asking about this: is it expressive? Is it meaningful? Is it ethical, beautiful, skillful, culturally significant? These are the axes on which we should discuss these things. Whenever we get in discussions about whether it's art or not, it ends up just being a huge waste of time. We're talking past each other. It could be art, but it's bad art. It's just not meaningful. It's sloppy, or just not very interesting, not meaningful, not expressive. But that doesn't make it not art. It just maybe makes it bad art or unethical. Moreover, I really want to argue the point that it matters how a work of art was made. I've really talked to a lot of people, at least within computing, who seem to believe that the only thing that matters is the visual effect that a set of pixels has on you. It doesn't matter where they came from. And so I want you to look at this picture here, and I'll tell you a few different versions of where it came from, and just see if you feel differently about it with these different stories. Because it could be that I painted this by hand with real oil paint, or maybe I just typed in a text prompt and this was generated in ChatGPT. So the question is, would you feel different about the picture one way or the other? So let me tell you where this actually came from. I volunteer in an animal shelter where I spend a lot of time with shelter dogs, and when you do that, you form relationships with them. You kind of you feel a connection, emotionally attached with them. So this was one dog that I spent a lot of time with, and I took a photo on the left when I was hanging out with him and petting him, and he looking me in the eye. It was kind of a moment. The picture on the right I made later by painting by hand digitally on my iPad. So it's a hand-drawn digital painting using the left photo on the left as a reference. And I would argue that this story gives you a different relationship with the picture than you had before. It means I have a very different relationship with the picture than other people do. And other people who knew this dog and know me have a different relationship to it than people who don't. And these differences are very important. Where the picture came from and how it was made is very important. And how much you know about that, or how much or little, or what your assumptions are, really affect the way you approach the artwork. Now, all of this happens within the context of AI hype, and this is really what I see as kind of the most dangerous part of all of these new trends. AI hype is not new. With the development of the perceptron in 1958, the New York Times says that on the front page, that the Navy revealed the embryo of an electronic computer that today that it expects will be able to walk, talk, see, write, reproduce itself, and be conscious of its existence. And this was just the perceptron. This is just equivalent to adding up a set of rows in an Excel spreadsheet and comparing it with zero. It's a simple linear classifier, and this was the foundation of consciousness, they claimed. And over the years, we have these headlines about artificially intelligent painters and computers developing covers that magnify this hype really beyond all proportion. And I think part of the problem is just the phrase AI, an artificial intelligence. If it was up to me, we would ban this phrase. And part of the problem is that the phrase AI, to most of us, to most of the public, I think, signifies really artificial intelligence that are much like people, because we have in our popular culture artificial intelligence like the friendly droids from Star Wars or the psychopathic Terminator. And so when the term artificial intelligence is used, it refers to these kinds of things. And yet our science fiction is not really about how AI, our algorithms actually work. They're really about the AI in science fiction are kind of like basically modified humans, because our fiction is really about people, and these fictional AI are really kind of like modified people. Yet what we're calling AI is really primarily a set of complicated data fitting procedures. But instead of fitting a line to a set of data points, such as in the plot here, it's about fitting extremely high-dimensional complicated functions to very, very large data sets with large amounts of resources. But in the end, it's still just fitting curves to data. And I do not consider that human-like intelligence on many axes. And we as humans have a very strong propensity to infer intelligence and agency in things that we don't really understand them. So, for example, the Eliza chatbot was developed in the 1970s as kind of a parody of talk therapists. It's a really simple set of rules that asks you a set of questions and reflects back based on things you said. And people had like emotionally intense relationships with it until they find out how it's made, and then they kind of feel a little bit let down. So if you say my AI algorithm is an artist, that tells people that it's like Data in Star Trek. It is an artist is a human-like entity. And so I think it's actually kind of an irresponsible statement. Again, I argue that all of what we call AI-generated art is computer-aided generated art, which means it's human-made art. Humans using computers to make art, often through these so-called AI algorithms. With database algorithms, the authorship is diffuse, so different people are involved in different parts of the process that led to the final work, but in the end, it is ultimately a human-driven process. So that's the discussion of where we are today with computer-generated art. But things could change. Maybe in the future, we will consider computers to be artists. And I want to ask whether that's possible and think about that. And essentially, another way of asking this is, well, why haven't we accepted computers as artists already? What would it take for us to agree that the computer would be an artist? And in order to do this, I want to think about, well, what does it mean to be an artist? What does it take to be an artist? And I think that these are really social behaviors. So what do I mean by social behavior? A social behavior is something that we do, at least in part, to affect our social relationships, like conversation with people and gifts and having meals together and fashion. Now, these are all things that have their own benefits. So we wear clothes to protect our bodies from the environment, but we choose which clothes we wear often based on how we want to be seen and what we want to communicate with other people. So it has its own intrinsic benefits, but fashion is really a social behavior. And I claim that art is also a social behavior. It's because we share our art with other people. We go see other people's art, often together. We like to talk about art with other people or talk about movies and books and music. We teach it to the next generation to communicate our values and our culture. We buy it, sometimes publicly, and then we display it in order to communicate our taste or our values or our wealth. And these are things that in some form have happened since before written history. People have always made arts and crafts in some form. And so there's an argument that art is really a product of our evolution. And here I really like the book The Art Instinct by Dennis Dutton, the philosopher. And so the claim is that art is a product of our evolutionary history, something that we do in order to provide for gifts, for sharing, for the place of status, for mating, and so on. And ultimately, all of these different functions of art throughout human history are about our social relationships. And I want to mention this one other paper which makes this case in a more focused way specifically for music and our ability to make music and care about music is really a product of our use of music for social bonding. Now, when I've given this talk, a bunch of times people have said, well, I make art just for myself, so doesn't that disprove your point? And I think that's great. Like, I really find making art to be a personally valuable thing. But a lot of our social behaviors have their own benefits. Like I mentioned, fashion also helps color your body from the elements. Language is something where I would argue we have language to communicate with other people, and yet people might talk to themselves, sing to themselves, take notes to themselves. That doesn't mean that language is not for communication. That just means that, but communication is the initial place where it came from. So in short, art exists for us to help affect our social relationships. And so as a result, we care about art made by people. Only people make art, and computers are not people. So I think this is a really important point. This is why we have not accepted computers as artists in the past, and why I don't think we're going to anytime in the near future. And just to illustrate these points, let's look at two alternative examples. There are many natural processes that produce things like landscapes and flowers and trees and so on that have a lot of the properties that we associate with art. They're beautiful, they can be emotionally impactful and really create meaningful experiences. And yet we don't consider the coast or the ocean to be an artist. Conversely, we do have social relationships with some animals. I think we're very open to the idea that, if my dog painted a picture and really seemed to care about the painting itself, then we'd be open to the idea that animals are artists. And it's just that we haven't found animals that really seem to care about, say, a painting as an aesthetic artifact and not just painting as a fun activity. So if that's true, then we have an answer for when we might someday together agree that a computer could be an artist. If it were the case that we developed human-level personhood, that is, AIs that really we see as people just like us, then we would consider them artists. But this is science fiction. Now, the algorithms we have right now are not people. They're text generators or image generators that are fit from data and follow understandable pieces of code. And so I don't see how we can see them as artists. Now, there are various kinds of AI that are designed to be social and conversational, like the Eliza chatbot, and Siri, Alexa, Cortana, ChatGPT. And it's possible that we could accept them as artists if we accept them as people. And we are hearing stories of people having this very intense emotional or romantic relationships with chatbots like ChatGPT. And personally, I find that really scary. I think that's quite dangerous, and I don't really think that we should consider them as people. But that's the situation in which we would accept them as artists. And finally, with most of our pieces of software technology, it's a bunch of code, even if that code involves fitting functions with data. I just don't see how, if we understand how the code was written, how they're run, how we could see this as artists. These are really human-driven processes. Now, another thing I've heard when I've given this talk, especially among computer science audiences, is that we're all just computers, or the brain is just a computer, or a slightly different version is to say that, well, we can simulate the whole universe in a computer, therefore that computer could be an artist. And I think, theoretically I agree with these statements. There's a science fiction world in which these are true. So maybe these are true statements, but these are not true statements about today's computers. And that's really what I care about here. I'm not talking about 100 or 2,000 years from now when we figure out how to automate the universe. I'm talking about the computers we can actually build right now or in the foreseeable future. So when I say computer, I mean a laptop, CPU, GPU. Here's a picture of when I adopted my dog. As a person, there's a dog. And if it were the case that computers and people are just computers, or that computers can simulate people, then we would be saying that computers and people are morally equivalent, ethically equivalent, socially equivalent. So I see no moral or ethical problem with wiping the memory of my computer, throwing away, erasing, recycling it or whatever. Whereas doing that with another person or with a dog would be illegal and very morally, ethically unacceptable. And anyone who says that people are just computers needs to, I think about what's the difference between a person and a computer, because I think there's a very sharp divide here. It's okay to wipe computers and not okay to kill people. So in short, computers are not people, and people make art. And all of our computer-generated art is really human-made art. Humans driving the process and using computers to make art. Now, as I mentioned, when I've given this talk, people have said, well, it sounds like you're saying there's nothing to worry about and everything's okay. And that's not what I'm saying. I am saying that in the long run, we are going to always care about human artists. So in the long run, art is safe from automation. But in the short term, there can be lots of problems and lots of concerns and disruption. And moreover, these things aren't simple. It's not computer AI good or bad. It's much more complicated. And I really like the writing of the historian of science Melvin Kranzberg and his paper on Kranzberg's laws, which is wonderful reading on this topic. And he writes that technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. It can be a very powerful force for good and for bad, and it's worth investigating and understanding the different kinds of consequences they can have. And I want to give a final example with a different artistic technology of musical recording. This was invented at the end of the 19th century by Edison. And before music recording, the only way you could hear music is to be in the room of the person performing it. With musical recording, that was no longer the case. You could buy recordings and listen to them later. It became very popular, of course, and within a decade or so, John Philip Sousa, the famous composer, wrote this wonderful essay called The Menace of Mechanical Music, in which he wrote that I foresee a marked deterioration in American music of musical taste due to musical recording technology. Again, this is a wonderful essay to read. I recommend it. It's very easy to laugh at the ridiculous things that he said. He made all these like scary predictions about how recorded music is going to, for example, turn children into automatons and remove soul from music because recorded music doesn't have a soul. But he also made points that are actually relevant to a lot of our discussions today. This article was really part of a campaign to add copyright protection for composers, and it was a successful campaign. And so there's a copyright story here. But I want to focus on the communal aspects. Before recorded music, it was very common that people would get together, families and social groups, and make music together. And as I mentioned earlier, there's strong evidence that the whole function of music is for social bonding and for these kinds of communal activities. I never learned to play an instrument, but I've heard that making music together is a really powerful social bonding activity. You really feel connected, and it's something that is relatively rare in our modern lives because we all can just buy recordings instead of learning to play instruments. There's one more campaign that I know of against recorded music, and this was with the invention of talkies, the ability to have soundtracks with music, with movies, rather than having performance musicians in the movie theater. And this is a wonderful image from a campaign against the use of recorded music in movies. That again, performance musicians claimed that recorded music has no soul as compared to performance musicians, and indeed a lot of performance musicians lost work as a result of this technology. On the other hand, we got new media and new styles such as tape loops, which were used by pop artists such as the Beatles and Pink Floyd in some of their seminal works. Moreover, the development of recorded music was absolutely key to the development of hip-hop, where now someone can create entirely new kinds of music by sampling elements of existing musical recordings using just two turntables and a fader. The development of recorded music has, in addition to creating new styles, created a lot of labor disruptions. And now I'm talking about video, but it's the same principle, such as the Hollywood writers' strike in 2023 was essentially the result of streaming technologies. So again, a different way to record and distribute media that allowed studios to essentially exploit loopholes and change the terms of how writers were paid. And in fact, look through the history of writers' strikes. Many of these were essentially responses to technological shifts that changed the way writers were paid. Or, as a friend of mine who was active in the latest strike puts it, they use each new technology as a new way to screw us over. So in short, when we look at musical recording and streaming, it made musical appreciation so much more convenient and flexible. We can all be listening to music all the time in a way that we couldn't before. And revolutionary new kinds of music and art came out of recording and streaming. Music concrete and tape loops and hip hop, as well as all of the massive changes that have happened in movies and film through streaming. On the other hand, most of us don't make music socially anymore the way that we would have had we been alive 150 years ago. And moreover, artists really struggle to get fair pay, especially My understanding is that music streaming online is especially bad for artists right now, and yet it's very hard to imagine giving up music streaming online. So with all of this background, we can make a few predictions about what the new tools will have, what they'll do for art in the future. Now, it's hard to make specific stylistic concrete predictions. Here's Les Paul, the inventor of the electric solid body guitar in 1947, and he played lots of jazz and swing tunes. It's very pleasant and nice. I don't see how he or anyone else could have predicted how his invention was going to change music and popular culture. You just can't predict what a new technology is going to do to styles and in any very specific way. Yet, with all the trends I've talked about, we can still talk about what the gross trends will look like. The future AI tools are not going to look like text to image. So much of the argument and debate has been around text to image. You type in a text prompt, images come out, and that's not the interesting stuff. That is a fad. It's often very boring, superficial kind of art. The interesting action is where more data-driven techniques occur within existing artistic pipelines, things that give artists lots of control to make things that are really unique in ways that were very different from the way that they were working in the past. And so artists are going to find great ways to use these tools that are much more controllerful and powerful than just stupid text to image. And new styles and techniques are going to emerge as a result. This also means that non-experts will have new ways to create and communicate. It's going to cause many painful disruptions for artists and read a definition of what an artist is and how artists work. That's going to be really painful and change a lot of how artistic production works. And so it also creates many difficult ethical challenges among these painful disruptions, who benefits and who is harmed from it. And does that mean that new guardrails or adjustments need to be put in place in order to account for these changes? But I believe that good art will always be hard to make. We're always going to be discerning audiences caring about the human behind the work. And so pure automation is not interesting. We don't care about it. We care about things that are really unique and special. And that requires not just typing in a text prompt. And we're always going to care about artists and always going to want art in our artists. AI is not a human-like person and therefore not an artist. And so all of the so-called AI-generated art is really human-made art. And this AI technology is going to create a lot of significant benefits and also harms all over the place. And it's also going to change in how we make and benefit art and understand art. And so the question is, how do we develop tools and ways to think about art and technology, and what guardrails and safeties we put in place, and so that we, as much as possible, benefit our own humanity through these new technologies. Thank you.